Hi there, I'm Acking Grimes, or Air if you prefer.
And I'm Haley.
I'm Jarika.
And I'm Jay, your DM, and this is Insight Check, where we delve into the dungeon of your bad decisions and retrieve the treasure of wisdom.
Are you sure it isn't intelligence?
It's a wisdom check.
That's
definitely.
also an ability in D&D.
I don't think any of us have much intelligence.
Let us
to
call
offer.
this intelligence check, where we provide IQ tests and then judge you for the rest of your life based on those scores.
Who randomly demands having an IQ test, Haley? Come on now.
And welcome to Arcana Check, where we read through the essays of your bad decisions and retrieve the knowledge of intelligence.
Retrieve the treasure of C minuses.
I'll just say charisma because we haven't said that word yet.
Welcome to Persuasion Check, where we try to keep you listening through this horrible intro.
Welcome to the Constitution Check, where we dive into the dungeons of your GI tract to retrieve the treasure.
Oh no, it's gotten
feces.
horrible.
This is not the magic school bus.
With the frizz?
I did not sign up for this.
No way.
I am Arnold.
Hang on, I can almost see the rails from here. If I just veer us left, I can get us back on.
Jay, I'll take care of it for you. Beep, beep, beep. I'm backing up the podcast.
Sometimes the quickest way to your destination is backwards.
Haley, why don't you actually explain the premise of this week's episode, since this is sort of your child?
Sure, I will introduce my baby. I decided that this week it would be fun to ask the people of the realms of Twitter what they wanted to hear about, and
The denizens.
that was the word I was looking for. Yes, the inhabitants of the internet, the inhabitants of Twitter. Those of you who saw the poll and voted, thank you very much. The highest requested of the 4 choices that I gave you was to talk about first-time DM tips, which is something that I was kind of hoping for because I'm a new DM and I want to talk about that too.
As an additional dungeon crawl this week, I wanted to make sure that we talked about a special project that our dear Jarika's heading up, her brainchild, but that has already seen the contributions of many members of the Shadow Council community. Why don't you tell us a little bit about February?
I would love to talk about February. February is an arts and creative prompts hashtag and also happens to be one of my favorite things to look out each day. We've had some really great contributions so far. Obviously, we're about a week or so in. If you hashtag February, the first prompt is under my Twitter at level 14 druid, which is LVL14DRUID. I think Fen is a really cool character, and I also really like portmanteaus. I know that there's some other people out there who really like smashing words together. And I was hoping that this might start some other C-Team arts prompts throughout the year. So I thought Fen was a great place to start because she doesn't actually have a whole lot of art and things that people have done for her. I know that there have been a few, but I would love more Fen in my life. I assume people would agree, and I know Jerry would definitely agree.
Fen is shaped like a friend.
Indeed. And there's so many really good, opportunities for puns.
Absolutely.
Fen is extremely punny.
So you're going to see February prompts retweeted by the Insight Check podcast Twitter. Of course, you can also get Jarika's Twitter handle there or in the podcast feed and just check it out. And if you have an artistic inclination, if you want to write or rhyme or draw or anything else, then feel free to drop us a February contribution with the hashtag February so we can admire your talent.
FENNBRUARY.
Absolutely. Queen of Jingles. Yeah, we want to give out Dungeon Master tips this episode, and of course, there's nowhere better to start than to look to some Dungeon Masters that we respect and admire. Now, of course, we've already done some advice on starting out and talked about Matthew Colville, Matthew Mercer, those kind of obvious people, Satine Phoenix. But, Ayer, there's somebody that we haven't talked much about that you have been into recently, right?
Yeah, for a while, actually. And it's funny you should mention Matthew Mercer and Matthew Colville, because I was going to, for this dungeon call, mention an interview that one Adam Coble, who is a dungeon master himself as well as an indie game designer. He is the resident DM at Roll20. He conducted with Matt Mercer, Matt Colville, and Mike Merles from D&D all about 5e, and he was trying to dig into why has 5e been so successful? Why is it kind of spearheading this whole golden age, this resurgence of tabletop gaming? And it was a really interesting listen because he asked some really interesting questions about, he feels that 5e or Dungeons & Dragons doesn't actually lend itself well to kind of the radio play podcast thing because it can be more mechanically heavy than some other systems. And it can, if you're trying to tell a story, sometimes it can be a little bit difficult if the dice don't go your way and you're looking for a more dramatic resolution to things that feel a little bit better. You know where the audience wants to go and the dice don't make it go that way. And Matt, and Mike had some really interesting ideas about why they think it's been so successful, why streaming has become such a big thing around tabletop gaming, and it's definitely something we'll link to on the Twitter. It's a really, really interesting listen.
Absolutely. I've seen a few times where Coble has brought up on Twitter his ideas about changes you can make to make Dungeons & Dragons a little more friendly towards streaming and online play. Different ways that you can alter stories throughout the run of the adventure. And it was interesting because Matt Colville kind of replied, well, you can do this, this, and this to make it more narrative. You can literally give it a narrative structure, have the characters lose something in the middle of the story, have some gain something at the end of the story, and become like lesser but different at the end. But is that really still Dungeons & Dragons? And I think that Colville has a lot of those kind of... He epitomizes the narrative end of the spectrum, I think.
Yeah, I plan to talk about that in a little bit when I think we're going to get into talking about modules and systems we might suggest.
All right, you rookie DMs, the people of the world are turning to us for advice, but they need to know that you guys are up to the challenge. I would love you to list your experience points out for them to understand, what level of DM that we're dealing with here for each of us. So that way they can kind of get a different point of view from everybody here at the table. Because we've all, I think, got different histories with Dungeons & Dragons, and we've all got a different level of comfort and experience with DMing. So I think it's going to be interesting, and I just want people to know sort of where we're all at.
Well, I have to say that just in my experience, DMing isn't about XP, it's about milestones.
Well, in that case, I have passed only the first milestone in that I have run one game. I made up a silly holiday adventure for these lovely people and some of our friends, and I ran it.
A very charming Haley Day adventure.
It was the Haley Day adventure, yes, because I'm all about the bad jokes.
The puns.
So I have
Did you enjoy yourself?
I did. I was a little stressed out, and then...
Did they enjoy themselves? In which case, I mean ourselves, and the answer to that is yes.
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 You navigated that trap expertly. You laid that trap for yourself, and then you navigated around it.
Christmas was saved.
Christmas was saved.
And that was
My
all.
heart grew 3 sizes and broke the measuring device.
Yay.
I want to say, Haley, the journey of running an entire campaign starts with the first one-shot.
Joraika, I think that you represent the second point on this spectrum. You've run a few more games. Is that not correct?
Yeah, so let me take out my CV here for a moment. So when I started Dungeons & Dragons, I realized immediately the potential that existed to run a Dragon Riders of Pern based game. And if you aren't familiar with Dragon Riders of Pern, just know that I am a huge dork.
Hang on a second.
Yeah.
Are you saying there's a dork on this podcast about Dungeons & Dragons? I don't believe it.
If you ever want to start this game up again,
So I was trying to run a homebrew for Dragon Riders of Pern, and I had everyone be Dragon Rider class.
So you started your first campaign with a homebrew class?
Yeah.
Wow.
That's like DMing on hard mode.
Yeah,
There was a reason
wow.
why it didn't last long. But, you know, I had a lot of fun. Like, they were charged with establishing their own weir, where the dragons live and get trained. And on top of that, they rescued this guy who, his name was Antarik, and he was an ex-dragon rider because his dragon died, and drama, and his brother's evil. We probably did 2 or 3 sessions of that, and I'm sure at least 2 of my players, perhaps 3 of them, were there to see how badly designed the classes would get as we progressed.
Oh, no.
Because I have no game design background at all. So I, was just like trying to translate things from the Dragon Riders of Pern books into D&D and not thinking about scalability or anything related to how D&D functions. So I got to
okay.
I got to a point where I was kind of terrified about just having designed it badly. So I was like, no, we're done. You guys got your weir. We're out of here. Like, congratulations.
Congrats. Good job.
Additionally, this is a long-ass CV. I've run 2 5e one-shots in my entire life. I ran Dues for the Dead, which is from Tyranny, and then I ran The Secrets of Sokol Keep, which is also from Tyranny, I believe.
You also ran a one-shot for us.
Oh yeah, that's another homebrew. We'll come back. So I really liked Dues for the Dead, and it really gave me a sense of how you can use skill checks as storytelling, because there's this one part where you're descending into like the catacomb area and you have to make a skill check because I assume it's a dex check because the stairs are old. So that's what really got it in my head, that you can actually do storytelling. Like, the checks that you have players make are related to the world they're in. They are integrated, and you can actually do storytelling with the checks. I really liked Dues for the Dead. And then Secrets of Sokol Keep, I remember drawing my own map for, because it does not include a map, or at least the copy I had didn't, maybe it got thrown away or something. So I had a lot of fun drawing my own map. And then, of course, I Google it, and there's this lovely, like, perfect map available online. The internet's a great resource for all these types of things. So those are my 2 actual Wizards of the Coast adventures that I've run. Then I recently ran the first section of my T-Team game, which is Acquisitions Incorporated in Thay, and it was fun. We'll get into this, but I always feel like I want to tell a story, and I haven't figured out exactly how to incorporate that into D&D without railroading people. But it was a fine experience, and I actually am currently in the process of writing, like, part 4, so.
Wait, we've only played part 1. You're already up to part 4?
Well, because I kind of know what part 2 is, I kind of know what part 3 is, and part 4 is the part that's interesting me right now.
Oh, okay.
All right. And so, last but not least on this train of individuals, it's Air. You also DM sometimes.
Because Jay never DMs.
He never does it even
talk
once,
about
not
it
even a little note. He's just gonna sail right past that into the sunset. Play forever, deuces, he's out. Yeah, I think I've talked about this on the podcast before, so I'll keep it brief. Check out those older episodes, new listeners. I started with 5e. I fell in love with Hack Inc. and ate up all the content and then wanted to run, so I had some IRL friends, and I ran them through a homebrew, actually. At least it was all 5e, but it was a custom world, even though I was grabbing bits and pieces here and there, and I didn't know what I was doing. I had a bunch of 7th level characters up against Vecna and his cult, and tried to tie in their backstory stories, and that was fun. That lasted a summer. Then I ran a little bit of the start of Hoard of the Dragon Queen, which then leads into Tyranny of Dragons. Spoilers, there's dragons. Tiamat features in it a little bit here and there. So ran a little bit of that, and I've run a couple one-shots since. Primarily finding players through amongst the Shadow Council, the fandom for the C-Team, Acquisitions Incorporated stream that we love so. And that's about my DMing experience as of yet.
And I'm your DM, Jay. So I started in 3.5 edition. I was asked by my cousin to play D&D. I thought it was like a bad word, but I didn't have any friends, and I wanted to do something social, so I agreed. I went to a friend of a friend's house. We gathered around the table. We sat down to play, and then they turned to me and they said, "Hey, you like telling stories, right? Why don't you DM?" And I was like, "Sure." "What does that mean?" And they were like, "Just tell a story and occasionally have us roll dice, and here's a book of monsters." I was like, "All right, let's figure this out on the fly." And literally, that's how I began. I sat down and I told them a story off the top of my head, and then we just played for like 12 hours. And we would come to points where there would be a relevant role, and I would be like, "How do I do this?" And they would be like, "Oh, you just turn to this page and this page and this page." And I was like, "All right." And I was learning as I was DMing. It was very jazz, I guess, is how I would describe it. It was very much improvisational and learning as you go, and everybody informing each other's choices.
That kind of appeals to me, like,
it was
lot.
cool. Yeah, it was very cool. And I think it goes a lot with my philosophy towards DMing even today. But after that, I frequently played 3.5 games with them. And then I moved on to Pathfinder relatively quickly. I just liked Pathfinder a lot. 4th edition came out, and we bounced off it pretty hard. None of my group really enjoyed 4th edition much. I tried to get them into it. I kind of liked it a lot because I thought the tactical combat was really fun, but they didn't really enjoy it as much, so they kept wanting to go back to 3.5 and Pathfinder. So we stuck to Pathfinder for most of 4th edition's lifespan. Towards the very end of 4th edition, around when D&D Next was coming out, and they were trying to, like, salvage 4th edition, I sort of started to drift away. Anyway, we took about a year break. I started up a Pathfinder campaign around the time Critical Role was getting kind of popular. I watched a few episodes, got the itch, went back to find some players. We started up Pathfinder again, because we all agreed that 5th edition is for babies. We played 2 sessions, and then I realized that I hated Pathfinder, and I wanted to play 5th edition so bad, it was killing me. So then I switched this over to 5th edition. We started a new campaign in 5th edition, and I've just been DMing nonstop for the last 2.5 years.
I'm a big fan myself.
But yeah, that's our credentials. Sometime on the show, we answer questions. And now is one of those times. Haley, you have a whole document.
I have a whole document. I went hardcore documentsy on this episode. All right, so first off, I think we should start with planning your big adventure, because I think this is probably where people might be the most apprehensive to get started, and so have gathered some questions from the interwebs relating to this. This question was asked on RD&D by Dark Mayor. They are wondering, they're saying, "Hey everyone, trying to find my first module to start with for my first ever game as a DM. I'm going to start off with the starter story set, but I'm looking for something afterwards." So they want to keep it in the Forgotten Realms. They want something that's more beginner DM friendly, but some suggestions for favorite modules maybe to start off our friends.
Dues for the dead.
So I think they're talking about the starter set, which contains the adventure Lost Mines of Phandelver.
Yes.
Yeah,
So,
which gets you from level 1 to 5, so they'd be looking for something for like level 4 or 5 characters.
So like a tier 2.
Yeah.
Ish.
Oh, what's that really good one that leads into Strahd?
Death House.
Yeah, Death House is a good one.
No, you gotta have some hot guitar licks behind that name.
Death House! There them licks.
How many hot guitar licks does it take to get to the center of the question? Who knows?
Just one.
Yeah, they don't know if they're concerned so much with level. I think they just want to make sure it's not like going to go off the rails and be complicated on them. Because I guess one of the other notes here says that they were intimidated because a lot of people said Princes of the Apocalypse is very sandbox, and they're worried that it would be harder for someone who's inexperienced.
Planning and preparation, ultimately, it just comes down to finding the sort of thing that you enjoy. So when you're looking for an adventure, you might want to use adventurelookup.com and go through tags of things that you are interested in. Look up the Faerun tag, and then look up adventures that have a lot of the tags you like. And that can be a great way to check it out. Maybe Forgotten Realms, I guess, would be the tag.
I was going to suggest that WotC actually released a product called Tales from the Yawning Portal, which is a series of short, kind of more bite-sized adventures of various levels. So I'm sure there's some good kind of tier 2, starting around 4th or 5th level in there. And it's got a variety of different things. If you want to do like the crazy funhouse dungeon, if you've got a group that likes sillies, you can do like White Plume Mountain, or you can do some classic stuff like Against the Giants. It's got a lot of classic D&D adventures that have been reworked for 5th edition. And if you're tired of the campaign, you can just run them through Tomb of Horrors.
Little tomb of horrors.
More like big, scary Tomb of Horrors. I was actually looking at Tales from the Yawning Portal for my next foray into DMing. I actually spent a lot of today reading through that first adventure and the setup. They actually set those up in a way that's pretty cool, that takes you from first level through really high levels. Basically the first adventure in that set is to take you from like level 1 to 3, and then the next one goes, I think, 3 to 5 or maybe 7. So it could be a good way to kind of not having to craft your own whole world, but you could craft a world around these little adventures, and it gives a little bit of advice in the beginning of the book on how you might do that.
And that takes us right into the next point on your list, which is world building.
Daniel Cotter has asked, what degree of world building does a player have in your story, and what they bring in their backstory? How much of that do you need to kind of use in your... How much of that do you put into your adventure? And then if players are kind of pushing you on their own backstory and their own world building, how do you deal with that as a DM and incorporate everyone's characters?
I think that a player's background is their buy-in to your campaign in a way. It's their contribution to your campaign. It's the only thing they get to make in your world. And you can inform that, you can shape that, you can work with them, or you can kind of let them just go and then make minor alterations to fit into your world a little bit better. Depends on the campaign and how much of the world they know before they get started. But they get to make the background for their character. Ultimately, like, you may make tweaks to it, but they get to make that background, and then you get to sort of flesh it out, add details, bring in new elements, but you have to respect what they brought to the table, because that's their contribution to the game, and that's their buy-in. That's the thing that they wanted in this game. So you have to respect it and understand it and appreciate it. But, that being said, you can't let any one player's needs overwhelm the players as a whole. You can't let one person be the celebrity and the others be the shadows cast by their glowing light and their brilliance. If you have a table full of wallflowers and one person who likes being the face, that's okay, as long as everybody's in on that. But if you have one person who is forcing themselves to the forefront at the expense of others, there are really only ever two solutions to this problem. One is to talk about the problem with the player, and then the second is to shift things slightly in the campaign to readjust the situation. I mean, first things first, you should probably have a conversation with the player. Just be like, hey, you're hogging the spotlight. But you should incorporate their backstory. You should definitely build their story into the world. That's what they brought to the table. That's their part. That's what they get out of it. They get to play, they get to have fun, they get to meet with their friends, and they get to tell this story that they're really interested in. And you have to honor and respect that.
I do think that it is a very common problem, this sort of player spotlight balance that you alluded to. And negotiating that is likely something most DMs who run a long campaign will run into, depending on their players' personalities. So I think what you outlined is really important. Communication is key. But, I think it's definitely a little bit of an art form. So if you feel like you have to be perfect at it right away, you're just going to psych yourself out. So just do the best you can. If it's not a complete integration, 100%, fulfillment, I think that's fine. But, if they've written on their character sheet has an enemy named Steven and hates Steven's guts, like maybe one of your NPCs is named Steven, and then you gotta go through at least you gotta go through the, oh, is that my Steven thing? So yeah, I mean, at least read your character's background, like, yeah. Anyway,
I love that. The treasure section just says "fuck Steven" 50 times.
Exactly.
I wanted to say that to get back to the theme of Adam Koebel, one of Adam Koebel's many achievements is he co-designed a game called Dungeon World, which uses the Apocalypse World system as the basis of it, and then grafts on a bunch of classic fantasy Dungeons and Dragons tropes. So one of the really neat things about that game, if you wanted to try out a different system, I find Dungeon World is really good for new groups because it's mechanics light and story first. And I think a lot of people come to tabletop role-playing games having maybe done like an RPG, a video game console or PC or something. And they're there and they want to know what's different about this. Like, why would I slow down everything? Like, why would I not actually get to see my character do cool moves and hack and slash monsters? And really, it's the narrative aspect. It's the freeing aspect of being able to collaboratively create a world. You're really heroic. You're really a hero. You're not just some generically created and PC character with no backstory with a voiceover and a big sword. So Dungeon World is really great because it actually, the first step in the game is everyone picks a character, fills out their character sheet, and then has to answer questions from the DM about their character's backstory. And the DM then has to incorporate that into the first session. The entire philosophy of a lot of these indie games is let's discover the world together. Let's discover the story together. So the DM is actually prompted to take whatever you make up about your character and start right there at making the game go.
And the way the questions are asked and what questions are asked, can completely change the scenario. So the DM has a lot of control over that.
Yeah, and the other neat thing is there's also mechanical elements to it too. So one of the types of roles you can do is to help or hinder other characters in the party. And so you have a stat called bonds, and that varies depending on how many bonds, how many backstory connections you have with other characters. So there's some suggested ones for each character. You can make some up, and the more bonds you have with another character increases your ability to help or hinder them because it increases your modifier against that type of role. So you are encouraged at the start of the session when you're making your character to talk about how do you know one another, who do you know from the party, and how have you two met previously.
Oh, I like that. It also encourages you to bond with your fellow compatriots and continue to improve those.
Yeah, it helps you at the table get to know the people because, now I have a connection with this person. They're my new bestie. So yes, I will make sure to, on the Twitter, link to the Dungeon World SRD, which has all the rules and all of the classes, as well as they have a free PDF with all the character sheets and all the basic rules outlined, and you can pick it up and play it really super easy. And I'll also link to a video of Adam Koebel running some fine folks through a session of Dungeon World, and they start right at the start, creating characters, figuring out how they know each other, telling a bit about about their backstories, and then he just runs a spontaneous one-shot based on what he told them about their background.
Raph has asked us if we have any advice for a player of theirs who wants to DM for his child. He's actually never DM'd before, and he's thinking he might have to run this in a one-on-one DM session. But do we have any advice on kind of kid-friendly adventures or any of that stuff? And I just want to call back to something that we talked about, I think, in a very early Insight Check podcast of an episode of Dragon Talk with Patrick Rothfuss, where he talks about not necessarily a D&D game, but like an interactive story game with his son. And he talks about using it to kind of instill some moral lessons and quandaries into a very young child's mind, and also just like have a fun interactive story session where it's more things along the lines of like, you're going to go adventuring, what do you bring with you? And it's like, I put food in my backpack and things like that. So I'll link that one. I'll link that in the when we post this episode, and I'll reply to Ref with that as well.
My brain goes immediately to the get out of trouble tokens from PAX Unplugged.
Yeah, it was on Unplugged.
The AI game. Yeah, so Chris Perkins instilled these little tokens that the players could use when they got super nerfed and were children. And it's basically like, oh, something just went sideways and balls up and pear-shaped. So here is how I'm going to RP myself out of this terrible, terrible situation. Help me.
Yeah, I think that could be a very fun way to give kids like an out. And honestly, I would suggest, give them a way to get out of trouble that doesn't involve them dying. I'm sure your child does not want to be killed.
Or making something else die. Yeah, I really like the idea of like, basically it's like a shared health pool, right? If anyone is looking to DM for kids and wants a super simple system, they don't want to get bogged down in mechanics and just want to tell a story, you should try out Dread. Dread is a system where all you need is a set of Jenga blocks, and every time the DM thinks that the characters are trying to do something that involves an element of risk, they have to pull a Jenga block, and if they knock over the tower, their character's toast. Might not be great for kids. You could certainly modify it around, but I really like the idea of having a shared pool of hit points or resources or something, because it helps get that empathetic socialization element that Patrick Rothfuss was talking about we need to share, we need to work cooperatively. So anything like that, anything where there's a shared pool of resources between all of the players at the table, I think would be great for kids.
I would recommend you keep it short, keep it active. Don't focus on story so much as creativity. Put them in interesting scenarios that grab their attention, but make them big and bombastic so that you can hold their attention. You want everything to be at, a high level of energy and silliness. Not necessarily, this is not a great day for like a political thriller.
Yeah, definitely make it a little more like maybe you go and like steal things. Maybe that's not an ethical thing you want to teach kids. I don't know. It probably depends on the age that they are too. Some of this stuff, like you might get into some more combat related things with slightly older kids. I think Pat was specifically talking about his son who's like 4 or 5. So that's not really like a talk about breaking into the places and stealing stuff and killing people age. It's more of like a go on a fun adventure and see the world kind of a thing. But it could be fun if your kid is more of like a young preteen age to do like a fun game for them and a bunch of friends and have it be interactive. All right, so let's peer behind the curtain into the planning of D&D. So
I have a lot of questions about this myself because sometimes it's hard for me to translate my brain ideas into actual like games that people will enjoy.
Mm-hmm.
I just want an entire book of Jerica phrasings. My brain ideas.
My brain idea.
All right. Haley, would you like to segue us in?
Oh, sure. Yes, Jerica, your questions are, I would say, mirrored all over the Reddits. But the specific one that I found, recent question on the new subreddit that I have been digging through recently, which is RDM Academy, which is a very cool resource. Ooh. I recommend you check it out. There's a very lovely community waiting to answer your DMing specific questions out there. So Gilgium, I am not good at these usernames. Gilgium asks, plot, summary, advice, flowcharts, boards, or ... question mark. I've been a GM for a while now, mostly running some older games, but lately some D&D 5e, and I've come to realize that my technique is in desperate need of improvement. Specifically, I'm trying to improve my games prep strategy, especially organizing notes and things like that. They've been considering flowcharts to lay down plot, but they're looking for advice on how other people handle this sort of thing. Any specific recommendations for programs, categories, or layouts of information that make it easy to use and plan?
I look at Jay.
I want to chime in here for just a moment.
I look at Jerica.
I don't know if this is the ideal solution, obviously, because I don't have as much experience as some other people, but who the fuck cares? I'm going to tell you what I think anyway. And maybe it'll get me into trouble, but there's certain plot points that I like hitting. And so for the first T-Team one-shot I ran, I used a Google Doc. I wrote it out kind of like a module where it kind of defined the spaces that the party would progress through. The world got wider and wider and wider, and sometimes you can go back to Area 1. And so it's nice to have that on hand. But of course, my one-shot was very narrow, and I did that on purpose. The wider the area that you're allowing your players into, the more you have to keep track of. So for me, the solution was keep it small, but allow for retracing and get some details down in your Google Doc.
You figured it all out. I was going to say, yeah, when I was planning the recent one-shot that I ran for these fine folks and other things, it was all about just writing it down, and I tried to invoke the same kind of plan around basically writing it like any module I would have read, because I wanted to give it to others to run if they were interested. Our good friend Embers has taken it, and I'm not sure what he's doing with it right now. I know he's planning a set of one-shots, so I know he might be modifying and running with it, which I would love to see. The idea of just throwing a group of people together and making them do a thing. I wanted to say to your point, Jerica, about like rail whirling versus whatnot. I felt that was a very, like, it definitely has points, and every group I've ran it for has gone through things in a somewhat similar way, but in each instance, even though they hit the same point, they all came upon those points and solved those points in vastly different ways, or in different, similar ways, but in different combinations of things. So, like, I think you can keep things on rails, but have variation. As long as you say, you come upon this encounter, what do you do? That you're immediately handing agency back to the players.
So that they can smash your world apart and stomp on it and and be like that scene in Blazing Saddles where the bad guys come into town and just tear apart the cardboard town. That's always what I imagine.
Yeah, they kick down the walls and just see you standing there behind the curtain going, I do not look. Jay, I would love to hear what you do to prep us weekly for the campaign we're in, where you are our DM.
So I follow basically a simple stratagem for planning out my worlds and my campaign. My basic idea is if it can be reached within a day, it needs to be highly defined in your mind. If it can be reached within a week, it needs to be loosely defined in your mind. And if it can be reached within a month, It needs to be generally defined in your mind. So you need to know the general flavor and flair of a location that can be reached within a month's travel. Within a week's travel, you generally need to know you need to know some specifics about a location that can be reached within a week's travel, but you don't have to necessarily know everything about all the major players or anything like that. You need to know who rules the city, what the problem is in that city, and maybe a few shops and locations within the city that are interesting. If it can be reached within a day's travel, you need to pretty much have that city done. You need to know what that city looks like, what that city feels like, the major players in that city, and the problem that's plaguing that city, the shops of that city, and those kind of things. So you need to, and that generally is enough to keep you safe, because if you travel to a place that's a month's travel away in your session unexpectedly, which has happened to me, you can at least have time in the travel part of the game to eat up a lot of your game time. And then at the end of the travel part of the game, you can just kind of give them a loose overview of the city, have them travel around, give them the flavor and the flair of the city. But you're not getting too specific. You're just giving them a strong visual impression. You're giving them the idea of what makes that city unique and special. And then the next session, after you've had a week or two to prepare, you can really get into the nitty-gritty of the city, because at that time you've prepared, and you've prepared the areas directly around that city as well. If you have an interesting location with interesting people in it, that is your tension, that's your plot. Creating, as long as there is interesting things to look at, interesting things to interact with, and tension, then you have a story.
Tension!
Jay, I have another question for you, actually, because I think it would be great to contextualize what happens when they run up against the hazy parts, because I think that might have happened in our last game, because we were kind of wrapping up an arc, and then instead had a huge chase sequence and battle on a flying ship. And I got the sense that a lot of that kind of was like out of a particular part of the anatomy, potentially. I don't think you were planning for that.
Out of hand? Maybe
yeah,
out of hand?
Yeah, that was probably the part I meant. So when we decided to chase after, when I decided to chase after this guy and drag everyone with me, what were you thinking about in that instance to, get us into some sort of coherent narrative?
Well, let me ask you a question. When you were playing that as a player, did you feel as if there was ever an instance where I couldn't respond to a question?
No more so than usual.
I have to say the biggest thought I had during and after last session was, oh great, we don't have to make the choice of who to give the MacGuffin to. Because we promised it to 3 different people, and the choice was made for us, and I felt real relieved.
Me too. I was like, oh, thank goodness.
Obviously, it's going to be this person that gets it. So then it becomes much easier, because instead of having it be, put the MacGuffin on the table and bring all the people around and say, okay, we promised it to all of you, big awkward fight or negotiation or whatever. Now it's, okay, this person has it. It's gotten a lot simpler. That person gets to keep it. And we just deal with the comers as they come.
What do we do about the big red dragon?
Yeah, I was going to say, one of them's a dragon.
Hide.
Yes,
run.
I went into the last session specifically with the thought that we had spent the first 2 sessions of the campaign with the tension very high.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So things had been very tense. A lot had been happening. It was happening very quickly. And the situation was difficult the entire time. There was never a moment in the first 2 sessions where it felt like, okay, everything's good right now. But I think at the end of the session, it kind of felt that way. It felt like this is a moment to breathe. Would you agree with that?
At the end of the last session?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, because I think we had come to a pleasing end of the arc. We had given the MacGuffin to one of the people, probably the person who deserved it.
We didn't give it to nobody.
Well, we did.
got
That's
given.
true. It got given, but it was definitely, of the parties involved, the one who I think probably needed it the most.
As far as, like, right and wrong goes...
Yeah, as far as
I was just
appeasing a
glad
dragon versus saving a life.
Didn't have to fight against you all to keep you from killing the Child King. I was so convinced that that's what was going to
different
happen.
arc altogether.
I thought you, Haley, did really good last session. You had a lot of creative thoughts and interesting reaction situations.
My cheat sheet has helped
but
me.
I, like, you know, calling the owl down and flying over, and then how you reacted to the ship being the only one there. I thought that you were in a lot of interesting situations, and you responded well to the pressure of those situations.
I did not want to be the only one on my party flying away on a boat alone. I was like, no, I didn't want this.
Favorite moment of the game is we managed to catch up, and Jarika's barbarian climbs over the side of the ship, and Haley says, "My character starts weeping."
Someone I know.
Yeah, yay, I'm not being abducted. Amber Alert.
Yeah, so I went into last session with the intention of decreasing the tension. I wanted to give you guys a down session, really. That's what I wanted. But at the very least, I wanted to ratchet down the tension a little bit because it had been very, very high. You have to give people downtime. You have to give people time to relax. You have to give people time to laugh at the table and time to, like, make choices and do their own thing.
And feel like they can mess up without dying.
For the most part, last session was massively dominated by character choice. Mm-hmm. I think that nothing happened last session that you guys didn't choose to occur. I didn't push my plot at all last session. You guys pursued your own things, and then it led to events happening.
Oh, gosh, no. I think we ended up in that situation because the person we were chasing had kind of screwed over my bard and used him as an implement in their own plot, and then out-barded him and cast an old person on him, and got the drop on me, and I knew that my character would have none of that and would pursue this guy to the ends of the earth, and fortunately the party went with me because my character's impulsive. But no, that's why I thought it was like, oh, did we just force you on the fly to create this entire situation? Because it definitely felt like player agency was the reason we were in it.
Yeah, I mean, you did, kind of. You forced me out of my comfort zone, but that's kind of my comfort zone. I love playing improv. I love creating situations on the fly. I do think a lot about the world, and I think a lot about where everybody's at and what everybody's motivated by. So that way, when it comes to improvising, I can react on the fly. Because I know what Domswell wants, ultimately, in the situation. And because I know what Domswell wants, I know how he's going to react to different stimuli. So when you provoked Domswell that you knew his ability didn't work on him, like that we're no longer under the mind control that you had been, and that Domswell couldn't manipulate you anywhere. Nobody's going to understand any of this that we're talking about. We're really talking to each other right now. But that's okay. I love talking to each other. But anyway, I knew that Domswell, when he knew that, he was going to be scared to hell, and he was going to want to get the fuck out of there because he knows that you are dangerous. He's aware that Bert is a dangerous figure. Perhaps more than anybody else in the party in his own ways. So he bolted, and then he bolted to a ship because it's the only way out of there. And then obviously he's going to take that ship to the biggest ship around. And then when he gets on that ship, he's going to look how to maneuver that ship. And then he has the only MacGuffin that can make that ship suddenly start flying. So he's going to use that. And then the situation just naturally escalates. And meanwhile, you guys had some bad rolls and misfortune that caused you to get dramatically behind him. So it allowed the situation to escalate further than it might have otherwise. And it just sort of became this sort of constantly escalating comedy of errors.
Well, I think I am going to constantly keep you uncomfortable then, sir, because it was definitely one of my favorite scenes of our entire campaign so far. We hadn't had a really good chase sequence, I feel. Well, we've had a few good ones, but this one definitely amped the tension from 11 to a billion.
Well,
and I loved it.
The situation was so perfect with him having the Gale Heart, the thing that you all desperately needed, him being this person you desperately hated, and him having access to the ship that you guys came in on, so you desperately needed that ship. Like, the stakes were personal, but they were very high.
I loved it. And Haley, what were your thoughts on it when we were running around like that?
I was terrified. Like, just completely terrified. So, to give so a little more context, I had one spell left. I think one.
I did too. I had
by
one
the end of the
first level
encounter.
spell. Yeah.
Yeah, I started the encounter with half of my hit points because I was expecting to go to bed and I didn't roll more hit dice. So if you ever, I'm like sitting there through the whole encounter looking at my like 7 hit dice being like, I'm going to die. And, and I am on a boat. I don't think it was, I was exaggerating. I exaggerate a lot, in a very serious voice. No, but I had a lot of hit dice, and I also don't really hit things with my sword ever. I just don't. And in the last...
You have such a cool
I do
sword,
too, but I also got all these cool new spells when I changed up my spell list finally, and I was like, wow, I'm just gonna use all of these like divine creatures that will fly around me and I'll be awesome. And then I was like, the boat is flying and my friends are 100 feet behind me and I'm gonna be alone forever and I'm gonna die. And so
that was a steep escalation.
And so I was like, I think that the best thing to do here is just to cast friends and try to be friends with this guy and slow him down.
It was such a Fia way to handle the situation. I really enjoyed that.
And it worked too. He was like, I can't stop now, but why don't you just go man the rigging and we'll work together on this? Like, it was truly an awesome session. It was very
It was a
enjoyable.
cool out moment.
It was a lot of fun.
It was.
And so hopefully this glimpse into our campaign will give you a little bit of behind the screen insight into what goes on in our DM's mind. I know it has given me some insight into what goes on, thought process behind things, but yes, hopefully we didn't bore you with talk about our campaign. We think it's pretty great. Speaking of behind the DM screen, since I gave the DM Academy subreddit a little plug, I also found that there is a behind the tables and a behind the screen. So our D&D behind the screen and our behind the tables are also subreddits that are full of some cool things that might be of interest to you. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Insight Check for what I believe is going to be New DM Tips Part 1 of question mark, because we only got through a small subset of your questions, and I think we can all agree that we would like to help encourage anyone who wants to start out DMing. Keep an eye out for the next time we get to your DM questions, and as always, if you have any questions related to D&D, DMing, or not, please tweet them at us using the hashtag InsightCheck or tag us at InsightCheckPod. As always, thank you to the wonderful Vin Swept for our intro and outro music, and to Amy T. Falcone for our lovely chibi faces. You may notice that we have some new faces for our returning guest cast members who are conveniently not here in this episode, but we have their faces now, so enjoy those. And if you have enjoyed this content even remotely, please give us a 5-star review on iTunes. We will love you forever.
Answering your cues from our collective A's.
This
Was
Insight.
Check.
don't do that to me.
Check. 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 You gotta segue it like in a lit way so that your lashes come out. That's the only way.
You and lit.
I have a coworker who is younger than I am, and so I say that a lot.
And she's lit.
She is sometimes
My
lit.
children will tell me, They just tell me sometimes that my ballroom music that I play was lit. They were like, this is a lit foxtrot. I was like, those words don't go together. Lit. Dance from the 1950s or whenever it was really popular. Anyway, it's fine. Edit that out.